Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. In this chat, I'd like to talk about indirectly, I suppose, the Antifa street gangs and the riots and the looting and the arson and the blatant intimidation of private citizens going about their business. This takes us back to 1920s Germany. And I'll give some background to this. At the end of the First World War in 1918 and the subsequent peace negotiations, the deal made was that Germany was responsible for the war and would have to pay large reparations, and the country was economically in pretty bad shape after the war. So how it was going to pay that was never really canvassed, but nonetheless, the government was sort of almost rudderless. They had a new constitution. The monarch had gone. They had an unusual constitution where there had to be an absolute majority of 53% of the vote before any party could form government, and this meant, as it does today, by the way, that there has to be various amalgamations and acting together and joining together, various political parties acting in concert to try and command a majority, like to form a coalition government. So, and that's the same actually in a number of European countries. Sweden and Norway and so on are also not dissimilar. It was a little bit unusual at the time anyway to have that type of voting system. So nonetheless, that was it. But it added to the country. It was already in turmoil. The systems of governance and state governance, systems of law and order had broken down to a very large extent. Courts were. So during this time, the communists launched a revolution, and they were called the Spartacists. And there were two Jewish, there was a guy, Karl Liebknecht, and Rosa Luxemburg. She was a communist lesbian school teacher, and Liebknecht actually had been a representative in the German government, German parliament there for a while, but had been arrested and done time for treason and sedition. But he was undeterred. So he tried to do a communist revolution. Now, the communists always believed that revolution would come in the most industrialized countries, and Germany was one of the most industrialized countries on the planet. They always thought revolution would come from there. They didn't think it would just become from poor. It would just, poor farmers would rise up, or that would be the best place to do it. Because Russia, when they had the Bolshevik Revolution, was largely an agrarian society. And indeed, other societies that embraced communism to any degree were also agrarian and quite backward in terms of. So the industrial proletariat was never really the ones that were going to rise up, but this was in the communist fixation. They thought this is how it was going to be. So part of the gig that Moscow engaged in, and communists generally engaged in, and the Russians funded it, was to create street gangs to go around and disrupt daily life, to disrupt sports matches, disrupt public meetings, disrupt court hearings, disrupt town hall meetings, to just and also to intimidate magistrates. For example, the communist goons would go outside a courtroom and would chant and intimidate people going in, slap people around, beat up witnesses, and would intimidate the court generally in order to get the verdict they want. Now, I want you to just consider the George Floyd case in the US, where sitting elected members of the US Congress went out there and, in my opinion, directly attempted to intimidate the jury and the judge and all those associated with that case. Now, they were doing the same in Germany, but on a much bigger scale. And if any one of their members was arrested, they would use those intimidation tactics. And they had street gangs running around with, the baseball bats and the pickaxe handles, all that sort of stuff, beating up people that they didn't like or that disagreed with them, and again intimidating anyone. And this made a lot of people, as you can imagine, very concerned. So the former military officers got together because the government was too weak. They couldn't seem, the police were really ineffective and wouldn't confront these goons on the street and so on. A lot of these police weren't getting paid, or their pay was so intermittent, and they could get laid off at any time. So they thought, why should we risk ourselves to protect the state when the state is in such disarray? And of course that was not an unreasonable position to take. But these ex-military guys decided they needed to do something, so they formed their own counter street gangs, and they formed it around a newly developing political party called the National Socialists. And this was meant to be a working party, and they're meant to be sort of lower middle class people running it, and they wanted broad appeal to the working classes and to the lower middle classes. So in effect, the communists and the National Socialists, who later had the name fascist attached to them, they were really competing on the street. So you had these street gangs, and it was running battles on the street. In some places, in shootouts between the gangs, hundreds of people were getting shot. It was that chaotic, and these were generally chaotic times in Europe after the war. National boundaries were being redrawn. There was movements of people around the place because borders were so porous. People were just slipping in by the thousands, and they didn't have any documentation, and all that sort of stuff. So you've got to look at a general situation of chaos and lack of control. So these street gangs were battling each other in the streets and through shopping centres and in shopping malls, sports pitches, pretty much wherever they could get together. Now the difference was the Nazi gangs were for law and order, and they didn't want communism. And so a lot of things the communists wanted, such as eradication of all religion and these sorts of things, this wasn't particularly popular. And in places like Bavaria, which are quite Catholic, for example, it didn't go down too well there. But the Nazis were fine with religion; they didn't mind that, or Christian religion at least. And so the Nazis were seen as really standing up for law and order and from preventing the communists from A, taking over, but B, spreading their mayhem on the streets. And to that extent, they were largely successful, I guess, and that played a big part into the popularity of the party. And to give you some idea, when Hitler would start doing town hall speeches, he was lucky if anyone turned up. Sometimes, one or two or three people would turn up. But after time went on and he was out there talking about stopping the communist thugs and the hoods, then the crowds started to appear as a lot of the Germans appreciated the law and order side of things and the stopping of these gangs. But that sort of mirrors a lot of what's happening today. And government has purposefully, in the West, has lost its direction and no longer has confidence in itself or its culture or its history. And it's into this void and this gap that agitators and goons and street hoods and thugs like Antifa can come into and spread their mayhem, while the government seems to sit back, powerless, unable to do anything. But it's what they want. They're trying to, the globalists clearly want this sort of mayhem to be spread, and effectively supporting it. The other thing was in Germany in the 1920s, the courts were so fearful of prosecuting the Antifa goons of the day, the communist goons on the street, that this concerned a lot of Germans. Why aren't you prosecuting them? And in the early days, where there was a lot of communists, communist sympathisers in the police forces or in the judiciary, they were happy to prosecute the Nazi street goons in the beginning, but were quite happy to let the communists run riot. And so this changed over time as attitudes did, where the government was forced to say, no, if you're going to prosecute them, you've also got to prosecute the other guys. And that's again an issue we have today in the streets. So just a bit of background on that Antifa and those times, and how the street gangs, the street gang situation in Germany evolves, and how it started, and how it inevitably led to the radicalisation of people that otherwise probably wouldn't have occurred. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.